Hi everybody, welcome back to the broadcast studio here at World Procurement Congress, powered by SAP Ariba. And today I'm joined by Adam from Hewlett-Packard and from Andrea from SAP. Fantastic, thank you very much for both joining. We're going to talk a little bit about supply chain and supply chain resiliency and all of those hot topics. So Adam, let me start with you. You know, there's been a lot written, I think, about how organizations are trying to build resilience into the supply chain. Maybe for many years we were really focused on driving efficient supply chains at the expense maybe of resiliency. And I think organizations are trying to seek, how do I build resiliency back in? I think it started with increased inventory, and I certainly saw lots of research that showed levels of inventory rising, not just at the endpoint, but throughout the whole supply chain. And I think many now are going, well, that's kind of a drain on working capital. Maybe we need to do something different, so maybe multi-sourcing and supplier diversification. But of course, if you are seeking to increase the number of suppliers, that means you're potentially doing less business with incumbent suppliers, which might put a strain on the relationship. So it's a long-winded way of asking, how do you balance the seemingly some competing agendas of resiliency and efficiency?
No, look, I think it's a good question, right? And I think it's something that a lot of us are toiling with in the procurement space. So let me just unpack resiliency for a second as it relates to your supplier relationships, which is fundamentally what you're talking about. Yeah. So if you go to multi-source, you're inherently or arguably splitting share to some degree. So first, I think it's all about the supplier relationships. So being transparent with your partners around what it is you intend to do and why. So one way to solve resiliency may very well be to stay with your incumbent supplier, but split the share across 2 geographic locations, limiting your risk. So if it's not at the component level, if you're solving for geographic resiliency, that's one way that perhaps they can retain that share and partner with you better. If in fact you need to split, let's say it's a single or sole source scenario, and you want to limit your risk on that basis, I think, again, the degree of transparency, being upfront with your partners and saying, here's the problem we're trying to solve and why, helps to better inform the relationship. And so I think, frankly, resiliency has quickly moved to the top of the subject line, perhaps where maybe it was more commercially oriented in the past. And I think people understand that across the industry. We're all toiling with the same thing. Their procurement teams on the supply side may very well be in the same position. So it's an understood narrative. But again, I think that honesty and that open dialogue drives a lot of that problem right out of the equation.
Yeah, so the transparency part of things, being transparent, even if it's transparently bad news, it's still transparency. Yes. That's actually keep. So people value that transparency. Organizations value that transparency because it gives them better planning opportunity, I guess.
Precisely. It's not always telling them what they want to hear. It's telling them what they need to hear.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks very much. Andrea, let me bring you in here and let's think about, you know, there's been a lot of disruptions over the last 4 years. Many people are actually saying it's now a permanent case of disruptions. What's the role of technology in helping procurement and supply chain leaders deal with those disruptions?
Well, very good question indeed. And well, you will never hear me saying that I love disruption, although it plays well for software to come into the game. However, I look at it as a big opportunity of data, because be it now disruption, be it transparency with suppliers, as you just mentioned, the truth is always in the data, and the chance and opportunity for software is making that truth transparent. First of all, of course, for the companies, so they can identify opportunities to overcome disruptions or drive communications with their suppliers, but also see where, in fact, their previous decisions put them into a corner, be it now by singularly sourcing from one supplier who actually never could really bring that demand that they had, or also being just too dependent on one region or too dependent on a particular way of shipping. All of that can be derived from data. So bottom line, leveraging data will, from a software perspective, support companies in overcoming situations, be it disruptions or communications with suppliers.
And it's interesting that you use the same word as transparency. So transparency over the data. So there's a theme here around that I think we can build on, around transparency on data, transparency on messaging, that transparency in the relationships, I think is really interesting. So let me think about the fact that we've talked about all these disruptions. How have they changed procurement and HP's strategic approach? What changes have you seen happening over the last 12 months, and what changes do you still see to happen that you're kind of expecting to see?
No, it's a good question. I mean, I think you look back at historically at procurement or sourcing's role in the organization, it was very much predicated on commercial value. So trying to drive savings, trying to drive improvement of supply, et cetera. But I think what the last couple of crises have taught us is that this idea of resiliency is incredibly important. And in a lot of ways, when I sit with board or I sit with leadership teams, that's what's top of mind for them, is how they can ensure the supply required to meet the needs of your customers. So if you work from the customer back and start to say, how can we best fulfill their needs? Happy customers are repeat customers. That's what grows your revenue. And I think procurement can step into the forefront of that equation to say, how can we take a leadership role in improving the customer experience? Whether that's supply, whether that's competitive pricing, it may in fact in certain areas be time to market. How do you become an enabler of driving time to market? So as I look forward, I think that's really building off what was historically commercial to now a resiliency orientation. Now I think it's got to be, how can procurement or sourcing become a competitive advantage in driving revenue and driving growth for your business?
So that's interesting, because I think there's two things that jumped into my head there whilst you were talking. One, how do you measure increased resiliency? And I haven't asked you that question in advance, but what's the measure? And I'll come back to that in a minute. But what you were saying was, if I'm paraphrasing, is recognizing how close to the end customer the category that you're managing happens to be.
Correct.
And recognizing that the value might be not in a lower price, but it might be.
Yeah.
But it might be in the speed to market. It might be in the innovation. Disruption itself might be a good thing in that category.
Correct.
How do you measure resiliency?
You know, that's a tough nut to crack, so you put me on the spot there.
Yeah.
But I think, resiliency, there's a lot of lenses, and it probably better tailored to a data discussion. But I think from my perspective, the ultimate measure is assurance of supply.
Yeah.
Right? Is your product ready to ship on time when you anticipated or needed to deliver? So things like a traditional metric around on-time delivery, safety stock levels, so have you built the parameters around your ability to deliver, and where you see risk, buffered or insulated your business from that. So healthy inventory metrics, on-time delivery is the classical kind of end customer metric. But then I also think we need to be more predictive in terms of understanding where risks may be. So one of the measures that we're looking at is major indices that drive commodity movements. So trying to get ahead of the curve and saying, what are the risks we think that are going to be occurring over the next several months or quarters, getting ahead and measuring that where possible. So you can be more proactive in addressing that concern down the road.
I think it's a really interesting point around the proactivity. Andrea, what are you seeing from our customers around how their strategic priorities are being evolved and changed based on all the disruptions?
Yeah, so basically, in addition to what you already brilliantly mentioned, which is the resiliency from reacting to actual happenings, the more operational prediction of reliability, stocks, and so on. I think there's another pillar that is very increasingly important and not so much yet found in many customers' daily business, and that is going back to what does the customer want. And customers or consumers increasingly put value into more soft measurements, such as how do we produce? How is the good that I am using produced? Is it ethical? Like, what are the suppliers? What are the raw materials? Where they are coming from? Is this in line with my ethical belief as a consumer, or is it in line with the increasing governmental restrictions that are put on companies? And here I see a separate pillar that also drives the way how we select suppliers, and that also impacts the spread of, or the decision what suppliers we select when having the customer in mind, rather than just looking at the price, which is a KPI, and basically everybody can look at that KPI. That will not need that much of work from the team or from a software to make that run.
Feels like a data transparency thing again, around understanding all the different components in the product that you were talking about there, which I think is interesting. Talking about transparency, supply chain transparency, and understanding the depths of the supply chain is a hot topic. I think supply chain visibility has been at the top of organizational risk. We run a study with The Economist every year, and last year it was the number one organizational risk that they wanted, the business C-suite wanted procurement to focus on. This year it's number 2, like 1% behind the monetary uncertainty, unsurprisingly.
Yeah.
So it's a relatively consistent topic. And I think a lot of this stems from, you may remember, I think it was the 2020 Deloitte CPO report. It said 90% of organizations can't see beyond tier 1.
Yep.
I think that's very industry driven, but even so, that's a problem, I think, isn't it? Because the risk always happens one step beyond where you can see, because you're not there. So I guess my question to you is, how do you drive better visibility into the supply chain? What are some things that procurement leaders can do?
You know, I view it through 2 lenses, and I'd actually be really keen to hear from a data perspective, because I think that's really where the truth lies. But, you know, one is, and maybe we're picking up on a thematic piece here, but one is ask the question. Okay? I think we've kind of gained this mythical approach that you can't get visibility upstream to the tier 2, tier 3 supply chain, but have you actually asked? So I think you start with a degree of pragmatism with your partners around, help me understand your upstream supply chain. What products go into your products, and where do you source them from? More often than not, what I find, unless there's an IP-related risk, folks are generally pretty open about that. Now, again, I would want to say, well, show me the data to prove it. Yep. But at the same time, I think it's important to...
Trust but verify, I think, is a phrase.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly. I think the second piece to that, though, is there's a lot of great emerging companies in the space right now that are driving... it's really a self-reported type of community, but community-based reporting, where we're all drawing off similar data pools. And so if one company signs up with another, you can draw off similar information on their platforms. So I think it's important for emerging procurement leaders or current procurement leaders to really evaluate the software landscape and the partner landscape out there to say, who's available, who brings the technology to bear to drive that visibility into my business. And again, there's a host of them here right now that I'm sure would be happy to tell you all about it.
Undoubtedly. Well, let's talk about it from a data perspective. What is it that we can do to help increase supply chain visibility?
I think a lot of it boils down to the willingness to share insights. And I personally believe, and what I see also in my conversations with different also companies that act as supplier, but also with companies that act as buyers, is suppliers are quite open to share that information if they are being asked. And of course, if companies are using the software where this data can be stored efficiently, because there's nothing more annoying than if you were being asked the same question like every other day from another person or from another company you're working with. So it's our duty, and I think but I will leave it to the audience to judge on that. I think we're having a broad offering that allows our suppliers to store this kind of data so that everybody can access it from a central place to avoid that repetitive asking. The second part to it is also on the buyer side. Not every data is IP relevant, and there may be, and there is, quite a huge benefit if industry related or even industry beyond industries, companies start to work together on these areas where they don't need to be scared to share information, share data, share knowledge bases that can be shared. And of course, there will be always that hidden secret of IP relevant and differentiating data that shouldn't be shared. But bottom line, getting to the point to understand, well, I don't lose if I share this information, even with maybe competitors. That will make a lot of difference, and I see that increasing.
So it sounds like trust, collaboration, transparency, just to continue the sort of thing, the trusting and wanting to collaborate with each other. There's a company that's talking about game theory right over there. So if we want to talk about trust and win-win and positive sum games, I think that would be an interesting thing.
And I love your point, by the way. I think it's worth just reflecting on for a second is, what if, as procurement leaders, we position the subject matter of data transparency as a source of competitive advantage for the suppliers? So the ones that actually come forward and provide greater transparency actually are at an advantage. We can actually condition that behavior over time versus have it beaten into people. So I think it's just a really great point that you raised.
So wanting to bring stuff, and I think with the future of AI needing to be trained on actual data rather than stuff that's out there becomes even more important, doesn't it?
100%.
Andrea, Adam, thank you very much for joining us and talking about the supply chain and all the wonderful things going on with visibility. And with that, we'll close out this session and look forward to speaking to you all again soon.
Thank you.